Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino. I've had this Kawasaki KLF400 Bayou outside warming up today because I'm going to drop the oil. I have a little bit of work to do on this thing. I obviously want to change the oil because spring's here and I want to get this thing ready to go. But I'm also going to pull off the right-hand side case cover. I'm going to change the secondary clutch in this thing today and do a little bit of investigative work. I've noticed that this thing's got a bit of noise and I want to know why. So why don't you sit back, grab yourself something cold to drink, and enjoy Dino's Tinker Shed. The old girl needs a little love, don't we all? This 1993 Kawasaki KLF400 Bayou, like most ATVs of its era, uses a semi-automatic shiftable transmission to actually move the motorcycle back and forth. Now, unlike a standard motocross or street bike, the clutch lever on the left-hand side of the handlebars is actually missing. It's really a brake lever at this point. So the shifting duties and the clutching duties are really shared down inside the engine itself between two separate clutches. Now, the first clutch is what's known as a centrifugal clutch, and it's basically a giant version of what you would find inside a chainsaw. So when engine RPMs accelerate, that centrifugal clutch actually expands inside of a drum and takes power from the crank and moves it downstream to the secondary clutch. That secondary clutch is what we are going to look at today. And it's extremely similar to a regular motorcycle multi-disc wet clutch. It has friction and steel plates and springs. The biggest difference is how that clutch is actuated. So instead of manipulating it with your left hand, your toe actually engages and disengages that secondary clutch. The movement of the shift lever both moves the transmission as well as disengages and re-engages the clutch. So we're going to have a look at that today as we change out those friction plates. They're almost 30 years old on this bike, and over the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, we've noticed that the bike has a bit of slippage to it when you're going up hills in higher gears. Now, a couple years ago, I changed out the primary centrifugal clutch, and that seemed to work pretty good, but there's still some slipping. So today we're going to actually take out the secondary clutch and replace it with a new clutch from Outlaw Racing Products that I got. And you can see by the look of the box, it's dusty. It's been sitting on the shelf for a long time, so more than likely there's not a high demand to change the clutches in a KLF400 Bayou. But irregardless, other clutch systems are very, very similar to this one if you have an ATV. So it's interesting maybe just to watch it if you're going to tackle a similar job with your Honda or your Suzuki or your Yamaha. They're usually fairly similar inside. Now, there is other ATVs out there that use a constant velocity clutch system, which uses a pair of variable pulleys and a belt drive extremely similar to snowmobiles. And a lot of newer ATVs are all using those styles of transmission. There's some good benefits to those, but these old ones also have some advantages in the fact you can select the gear range you want. You don't have to worry about belts wearing out. There's some advantages to these older units as well. So why don't you sit back while I get this thing taken apart. Located on the right-hand side of the motorcycle is the clutch covers themselves. You can see them here. The first thing I'm going to do is take this rubber cap off. Now, this covers the spline shaft where you can put the Kickstarter mechanism on in case the battery dies. It's a bit of a safety feature. Once that's off, I'm going to turn my attention to these screws or bolts here that hold the
the lower skirt on the rear fender. Now these bolts run along the midpoint of the fender, and although these ones aren't stock, the stock fasteners perform the same function. So I'll just pull all of these out. Once you get the skirt off, you can actually see the support for the fender here, so you can give it a good inspection on that. And then I'm just going to clean out my oil pan so that when I drain the oil, I can see if there's any contaminants. I'll slide this under the bike and I'll locate where the drain plug is. And it is a 17mm socket that you're going to need to get this off. Make sure you're turning the right direction, trust me, and then break the oil plug free. Once you get the oil plug drained or opened, it's going to drain almost 4 liters of oil here. So make sure you have a large enough tank to hold it. Here you can see the drain bolt from this bike. And it has an aluminum crush washer that's basically pressed on this thing. Now it does leak a little bit, I noticed. It's probably due for an aluminum crush washer replacement. I'll see if I can find one at my local motorcycle supplier. I'll bring this in and see if I can find one to replace it. If not, I'm just going to have to go with this, and it'll drip a little bit until I can order one. As the oil drains here, you can kind of see the shape of the 2 clutches on the outside of the cover here. This is your primary clutch, so this is that large centrifugal chainsaw clutch that sort of sits in this area. And this side over here is your more traditional motorcycle clutch. And that's the one that we're going to want to get to today. Now you can see the oil's just about all drained out. And I'm going to make a template to actually take all these bolts out so that we don't mix them up. I've done this before in past videos, but I think what I'll do first is I'll get this oil filter off of here now that the oil's just about drained out. I'm going to take the oil filter off now before I take the cover off. Now I can just twist this one by hand, but if it's too tight you may need to get yourself an oil filter wrench to do this. Now once the oil filter spins off completely, I'm going to actually dip my finger in here. This is a good opportunity to see if there's any kind of contaminants, any metal or shavings or anything up near the oil filter. This one's really clean and I'm happy with it. Now all around the case half here are 15 bolts that hold that case half in, and they're held in with an 8mm headed bolt. They're probably an M6 or an M5 or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. But anytime you're taking a case half off like this, there's the potential for different length bolts. Some of them are through bolts, some of them are blind bolts, meaning they bottom out in a blind hole that doesn't pass straight through. So you want to keep all that hardware in order so it goes back in the same hole that it came out of. Now if you've watched my channel before, you're going to know I'm a big proponent of the template. So I basically do a really rough diagram of that side case. I mark all of the bolts with a X so I know, I double check, count, make sure I have the right amount. Then I'll punch little holes on all those X's, and as the bolts come out of the case, I put them into that template, and then that template goes up on the bench. I don't have to worry about losing the bolts or getting the order of them mixed up. It's a little bit of a tip. If you saw me do my DR650 clutch, I did the exact same thing, and I find it to be a very, very good thing to do. Now, before we get into this, I'm going to say one more time, I do this all the time, is get yourself a manual if you're going to start to take these things apart. There's a lot of complexity within these engines, and what can sometimes happen is you can get into them and then you can't remember how the things went back together. So take lots of photos, but if you can, buy a manual. They're like $30 or something. They're not a lot of money. They'll save you a lot of headache. You don't have to hop on your phone all the time looking for information and trying to sort through what's real and what's not on all of the different forums. The manuals really can save you a lot of time, and in the end, even some money. I'll simply remove these bolts and store them in the template that I made. I really do enjoy using these small quarter drive impact guns for these types of jobs. They really do break these types of bolts free much easier than a regular ratchet. here you go. This is the entire bolt circle all the way around. Everything's in its place. I kind of know how it fits. Everything looks good. To get this case half off, I'm actually gonna just go around and tap it lightly with a soft face dead blow hammer to see if I can loosen it up. They do stick on here pretty good, but normally I can get these off not too bad. But just take your time. Try to avoid using a screwdriver to pry these things off. There are a few spots along here where you can do that. There's little pry tabs, but I like to just sort of gently sort of persuade the case first if I can. Just use a soft face hammer, not like a claw hammer if you can avoid it. You can also use a little bit of wood on there and sort of hit it like a chisel. I had this off about a year and a half ago, and it should come off. We'll see. I might need to just pry ever so slightly right there. Let me just see. Let's see if I can pop it off here with this. And it's just gentle, gentle, gentle. If it won't come off, just keep going around and looking and trying to figure out why it won't. And eventually you'll get it. I know you will. Goes. So now this should just slide straight out, hopefully. Okay, it came off.
At the very bottom of the case is a small oil screen that I'm going to pull out.
Now here is something that I don't like to see. This might look like metal, but what all of this is little bits of silicone that probably after I put the side cover back on the last time, shredded off and gets circulated through the engine. Now there's more in here than I would like, and I don't put a lot of silicone on, but it shows you that this stuff can really get and work through the engine and cause problems. This is why I prefer to just use a gasket, but I don't have one, and I don't think I can locate one in time to put this thing back together.
With the case cover off, you can see the silicone that remains on the mating surface of the case itself. I'm going to remove this, starting with one of these plastic razor blade scrapers. These things work really, really well for aluminum. I'll clean up all of the oil inside as best I can, and then I'll make sure not to lose this O-ring here. This fits down right here, so I'll set that aside and won't forget it. I know I won't. And then I'll use the plastic razor blade to scrape the majority of the silicone off of all the gasket surfaces. I'll also use a small screwdriver to pick out any old hardened silicone that's found its way down into these galleries. I'll use a conditioning disc on a die grinder, not a sanding disc, and prep the surface so that it's nice and clean and all of the old gasket sealant's gone. I'll follow this up just with a little bit of brake cleaner just to make sure the surfaces are oil free.
Now that we have the clutch open, or the clutch case open, we can actually see the two different clutches. This one here is that centrifugal clutch that I talked about. So it's connected directly to the crankshaft of the engine. As engine RPMs increase, these yellow pucks here actually expand on the inside of this clutch drum. When that happens, they will actually start to turn this drum. And you can see it's attached to the secondary clutch over here. So it transmits power smoothly from the crankshaft through to the secondary clutch. Now the clutch itself here has basically a little throwout bearing in that, and this right here is connected to the toe shifter across the way. As you shift, it moves this little lever back and forth, and inside the clutch case itself is a small mechanism that rotates, and as it rotates, it pushes in against this plate here. What that does is it releases the clutch pack and allows the transmission to divorce itself from the secondary clutch pack. So even if you're moving along at 30 miles an hour, your primary clutch is fully engaged, it's spinning the secondary basket. When you push down on the toe shifter, it disengages this clutch pack from the transmission and allows you to shift gears smoothly without a big clunk. And as you release the toe shifter, it re-engages this clutch pack and allows the bike to continue moving. It's a really clever design, and it really is relatively bulletproof, I suppose. But I do think these clutch discs here, they're a wear item, and I think it's time for those to be replaced. The kit comes with new springs, new friction plates, which you can see kind of loose a little bit. Not loose, they're just sort of loose inside the basket. And it also comes with friction steels that goes in between each one of the friction plates, basically like a phone book, if you lace a couple phone books together. So what we'll do is we have to take the primary here off. That allows us to disassemble the secondary clutch and repack it. Now before we do that, I'm going to take apart, well, I'm actually going to measure to make sure that the clutch pack that I purchased is the same diameter. I think I can do that right in here just with a tape measure. It'll give me a rough idea before I open up the blister pack. But once I'm confident that I have the right replacement clutch for this, I'll take it out of the blister pack and I'm going to soak it in engine oil to make sure that those clutch plates, especially the friction plates with the cork material, get saturated with oil. If you don't do this, you run the risk of burning the clutch out as soon as you start the bike up. Now, some clutches, like my DR650, say that you don't need to do that process, but I still do. I don't think it hurts it to actually soak it a little bit. But overall, everything inside here looks really clean. It moves really good. The only thing that I see is there's a little bit of wear down here on the nylon oil pump gear. I'm going to see how available that is, and if it's available, I'll change it out while I have the case half opened up here. Now, it seems to me the last time I had this open, I actually just used gasket maker because I didn't have an actual gasket for this. I like to use a gasket if I can find one, and if I can find one for this engine quickly, then I'll do that. If not, I'll just use a little bit of gasket sealant. The other thing I noticed is this nut here had backed off a little bit. I may have failed to Loctite that on or torque it up to the proper specs the last time I had this case open. So it's actually a good thing that I sort of took this apart. It had a little bit of a growl, and I'm wondering if that's what it was. It was floating a little bit on that shaft. Other than that, it looks really good in there. To start removing the clutch, the first thing we have to do is actually remove the shifter arm here. So we're going to take this little washer off, and I'm going to take note here of the orientation of the shift shaft. It points directly to the center of the secondary. Following this, I'm going to remove the throwout bearing, and you'll notice that one side is machined and one has the numbers on it. The machine side on this one anyway faces outward. I'm going to use this clutch tool here. Now this is basically like a pair of vice grips with pins on it. And this fits inside the primary here and allows you to get some leverage to break the nuts free on both clutches. There's 100 pounds of torque on the secondary and 122 on the primary. So you really need to get your leverage down to get these things off. Eventually though, the nuts do come off. This one here is actually really loose. Again, this was the noise I was hearing. I didn't put enough Loctite, or if any Loctite, on the last time I had this off. To get the primary off, you actually just sort of wiggle it and it'll walk out. And it's a little bit difficult, and the reason for this is there is a one-way bearing on the back of the clutch pack. You can see it right here. It only turns in one direction when it's inside the hub, so you kind of have to wiggle your way out. But once you have the clutch pack out, you can grab both clutches and gently slide them out far enough that you can get the secondary clutch out from behind the primary. Now, I'm just going to push the hub back on here for the primary, and then we'll take a look at the secondary up on the bench. Here you can see the clutch. It comes apart, and it's got a few different components in it from maybe some of your traditional motorcycle clutches. One is this very heavy ring gear on the back, which is fed from that primary clutch. And you can see it's actually spring damped a little bit to probably make it smoother so it engages better. Other than that, it has a pressure plate, same as a regular motorcycle clutch, and it has the outside basket and I guess the carrier on the inside here and all of your friction plates inside. I think this will just pull out as a unit. And there's your actual clutch pack right there that we're going to take apart. So it looks like it's in pretty decent shape. I don't see a whole lot of cracking. There's some here. It always happens with these cast aluminum pieces. But there's no real wear or anything on this to speak of outside of what I would expect. Now the clutch basket itself, again, looks like it's in good shape here. I think it doesn't appear to have any cracks or any damage down at the bottom of the basket fingers. You can't see anything on the outside either, so I think this is in pretty good shape. All the surfaces feel just great on it. So we can get to work on actually taking apart the clutch pack itself. Basically going to take these 4 bolts out here, and we'll do them a little bit at each time so that we don't stress this or twist it in any manner. It looks like it might be 10 mil. There we go. So I'm just going to crack these if I can. There we go. And I'm going to go right straight across from that one over to here. And crack that one. There we go. And then over here, and I've got to get a rag on this. That one's really tough. There we go. And finally, this one here. There we go. And I'll use this little guy here just to go around a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there. You can see that they're all just a little bit. Feels like maybe they are at the end here. Okay, I'm just going to pull that off. That looks like it's in good shape. And now off come the springs. So I can compare these. I'm actually going to measure them to what the factory says these things should be. And then I'm going to compare them to the ones that I've bought, because the ones that I bought are of course aftermarket, and they're supposed to be super superior to the factory springs, but I'll be honest, these ones are pretty robust. Let me go get them and we'll have a look. Now this is interesting. So here is the aftermarket spring, and here is the standard spring that came out of this clutch. There's definitely a thicker spring material on the aftermarket spring. What's interesting to me is when I measure the free length, and this is how you determine whether or not the clutch spring is worn. So here's the free length. It's 33.1, let's say, 0.11. The standard, so a brand new spring, is only supposed to have a free length of 30.38 millimeters with a wear limit of 28.8. So this is 3 millimeters longer than it's supposed to be right from the factory. So perhaps somebody changed these out to these special super clutch springs. I don't know. If we take the ones that I just bought and measure those, they're 30.86 millimeters. So these are much closer to what the factory is supposed to says you're supposed to have in here. They're a little bit longer, but not a lot longer. But I believe the coil thickness is actually a little bit thicker on these, and I can probably measure this. Let me see here. So this is 2.71 millimeters thick. The ones that are coming out are 2.61 millimeters thick. So there's definitely a thicker spring here, but it's shorter. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. So I'm going to use the new ones. I thought I was going to use the old ones until you measure it. And this is why the manual is so important. you would never ever know these springs here were the wrong length when you pull them out. You would think those should be the right ones, but really it's these ones here that you're supposed to have. Let's continue taking this apart. So out comes the internal part of the basket, and we're going to check all of these areas here. You want to come around and look at all of these little gear teeth here to make sure they're not deformed, that they're not in bad condition at all. And these ones look really good. There's no cracks in the housing that you can see. It's really in good shape. Here is the friction material, and right away you're going to see this one is a different type of friction material than the one that we got. The one that we got is a solid friction material. So I'm going to measure this too. There's actual wear limits for the thickness of these, so I'm going to check those right now as well. So it says it has a wear limit of 2.8 millimeters on that friction material. 2.97. The maximum there should be is 3.06. So this is worn, but it's not terribly worn. I'd have to put these onto a bench to determine if, like an actual flat surface, to determine if these are warped. Here is the actual friction surface here. So I just want to keep in mind that it goes back in right away with a friction disc. We'll let the clutch discs that we just bought soak overnight before we reassemble it, and then we'll put it all back together and it should work quite well.
Installing the clutch pack is quite easy. We start with the hub and lay it flat on the workbench, and then place our first friction disc down on the clutch. Next, the steels slide over the hub, and we make an alternating lasagna of friction clutch goodness all the way up to the top until we finally finish off with another friction disc. Now I'm going to just line up all of the friction discs so the tabs line up here. You can see they're all lined up nice. And this allows us to put the pressure plate on the top. It should just slide over and index down into the grooves.
See that little dot right there? That lines up with the piece below it, so that this pressure plate will actually drop down into the clutch discs. If you don't get these dots lined up right, what will happen is this plate will actually sit up a little bit and it won't drop down cleanly into the clutch basket. And you'll put it all back together and the clutch plates will actually move. So you need to make sure everything's lined up right there, and then we can take this and drop it down into there.
With the pressure plate back on, I'm just going to make sure that everything is lined up before I get to the next step. Everything looks good here, so now I'm going to start installing the springs. So the springs just sit over top of these towers, and then I'm going to put this retaining plate on top of that. Next, I'll just insert all of the bolts finger tight so that the springs sort of are snug at this point. Following this, I'll run the actual bolts in right to the face using this T adapter here, 3/8 T adapter. And then I'll torque them down to 22 inch-pounds so that the whole clutch pack is tight. Shouldn't really have any movement at this point. You can still pull the clutch pack out, but it will go back in.
Shouldn't be able to.
Ah, yes, you shouldn't be able to. That's right. You should not be able to turn this actual clutch pack, and here's what's happening. So if you look here, these teeth that I looked at earlier, these are supposed to fit all the way down into the grooves here under the blue square. And what happens if you don't index them like I talked about, they'll actually sit a bit proud, and this leads to gaps in the clutch pack. It'll never ever work right this way. So I actually had to take it apart, re-index it, but eventually I did get it to fit nice and tight within the clutch basket. Simple mistake. I'm going to mop up as much of the old residual oil out of the crankcase here as I can before I put on the new clutches. These just slide on the way they came off, but you want to make sure that you get them seated right, and take a look at the Kickstarter gear in the upper left corner. It should turn with the clutches. Then you know you have it on right. keep an eye in behind the primary for your oiler gear. Now this sits on a Woodruff key and can sometimes come loose, which will starve the engine of oil. I'll scrape all the old gasket material off here, and I'll walk the primary clutch pack back in, rotating the hub backwards. This walks that one-way bearing in. Now I'll just apply some red Loctite. I'm not going to buy new nuts for this. And the red Loctite should lock these down. They have a tremendous amount of torque on them. I'll run the nuts up by hand as tight as I can, finish them off with a ratchet, and then get my 1/2-inch torque wrench out. These things take a lot of torque, and I use that clutch tool tied to the footrest with a strap and make it work.
Now that I have all the surfaces cleaned up, I'm going to get to work on applying gasket sealer all the way around here. Before I do that, I'm going to use a small paintbrush here, and I'm going to apply some grease down into this hole. This is where your shifter mechanism fits. And I always like to put a gob of grease down in there to make sure that that doesn't get any unnecessary wear. This pin here adjusts and centers the placement of that shifter. It fits in this little pocket here. You can move this eccentric pin from the outside, and that adjusts the center point to make sure that the toe shifter is in the right place. It gives you probably about a 1/16 of an inch either way. I've got it just about centered here, you can see. But that's what that pin's for. I'm going to use this little paintbrush, and I'm going to use Moto Seal here. Now some people just goober the crap out of this. You've probably seen me do this a couple times now. I use a little paintbrush, and I just come in with a paintbrush and paint it all on the surface here. Just put a little coat on all the way around. And that tends to be enough to seal the engine up.
Now when you're putting the case half back on, you just want to make sure that it slides in. I didn't have the camera on, unfortunately, when I put this in, but you want to make sure the dowel pins all line up, and it should just slide nice and easily onto the dowel pins. And before you start tightening it up, I like to check with my finger and go all the way around to make sure that the case cover is seated against the case half squarely before you start running bolts in. But now we'll just put all these bolts right back in, and they should just thread in quite easily. Now I'm going to use just my small drill here, and I'm going to set the torque on it very low, and this will just run these things up without worrying too much about stripping them out, and just save a bit of time. To torque these, the torque value is 8.8 Newton meters. My 1/4-inch drive torque wrench doesn't even go down that far, so I'm just going to tighten these up by hand like this, and just sort of walk around and tighten it down till I feel that they're snug. That's the best I can do right now, because I do not have a tool that will allow me to tighten these up properly. Before we even put any oil in this, I am going to adjust the clutch, and to do that you do it underneath this cover, the clutch release cover. So I'm going to use this JIS, or Japanese Industrial Standard screwdriver, to take out these 2 screws that are in here. And that will give us access to the adjustment bolts underneath. What you're going to see here are 2 adjusting bolts. This lower adjusting bolt here is that eccentric pin that we looked at. This adjusts the placement of the toe shifter. The upper nut and screw here adjusts how far out from the clutch pack the ramped mechanism that's in there sits. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to use this ridiculously long screwdriver here so that I'm not in your way, is first thing we're going to do is break free this 12mm nut here, like that, so that we have lots of free play on this nut. Next, we are going to turn this clockwise until we feel resistance. So
So it comes all the way out. And what we're doing here is we're actually pulling that cam plate away from the clutch. Next, we're going to turn it counterclockwise. And we're going to turn it counterclockwise until we feel a little bit of resistance right there. So that means that the plate is actually touching the, I'm just going to walk this down a bit here. It's actually now touching the clutch pack. I am just going to snug down this jam nut here. This should have the clutch in perfect placement now. So when you step on the toe shifter, it will push in that cam, releasing that secondary clutch. That's what we want.
Okay, we're ready to add some oil. So I'll lubricate the O-ring on the oil filter with a little bit of fresh oil, and I'll just spin this up by hand. You don't want to over tighten these, so you just basically tighten them up as tight as you can by hand. You don't need to use a wrench. Next, I'll add about 3.5 liters of motorcycle grade 10W30 into the crankcase. Once I get that done, it's really just a matter of opening up the door and running her outside to test.
Here goes nothing. Run okay, doesn't look like there's any drips. I'm gonna let it warm up out there for a little bit, bring it back in and check the oil one last time, and then put the fenders back on, and this job should be done. Okay, let's put side panels on. Seems to work pretty good. Okay, that wraps up today's episode on changing the clutch on that KLF400 Bayou, and it was really fun, and honestly, it was not all that hard. I'd say it's probably a medium skill level. Any home mechanic can do that job with just some basic hand tools, a manual, and maybe about 4 hours of time to really get into it. Now remember, older motorcycles like this tend to have more issues than you expect them to have, so if you are going to tackle a project like this, leave a little bit of time for things you're not expecting. Maybe gears that are inside that are a little bit worn, things like that, that you may want to take advantage of while you've got the case cover off. But overall, it's really, really simple. It's just turning nuts and bolts and then putting them back together. It really is that simple. If you liked the video, by all means, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you found it entertaining, if you want something different from the channel, let me know because I'm interested. But until then, I'm gonna get back to work. I've got some other things that I need to do, especially on my DR650. So you have yourself a great day, and hopefully I'll see you soon here on Dino's Tinker Shed. Okay, bye for now.